On May 28, 1987, a small Cessna aircraft appeared over Moscow's skyline without warning. Soviet citizens walking through Red Square looked up in disbelief as the plane descended, circling the Kremlin before touching down near St. Basil's Cathedral.
Well, I came across the bridge here, and when I came close, I could see there was a small plane. People were curiously climbing up and looking inside, and some people were talking to the pilot and asking him questions.
The pilot wasn't a spy or a military defector. He was Matthias Rust, a 19-year-old from West Germany who had just accomplished what seemed impossible, penetrating the world's most heavily defended airspace in a rented plane. This single flight would trigger a political earthquake that shook the Soviet Union to its core. The pilot, who was Matthias Rust. Matthias Rust grew up in Wedel, a quiet town near Hamburg in West Germany. Nothing about his upbringing suggested he would become a household name. He was a sports enthusiast who enjoyed flying, earning his pilot's license in 1985 when he was just 17. By most accounts, Rust was an ordinary young man with one extraordinary characteristic, an almost naive sense of possibility. In interviews after the incident, Rust claimed his motivation was idealistic. He wanted to build what he called an imaginary bridge between East and West during the height of Cold War tensions. He believed that a symbolic gesture could promote peace and dialogue between the superpowers. Some saw this as genuine conviction. Others viewed it as the grandiose thinking of an immature teenager who couldn't grasp the real-world consequences of his actions. Rust wasn't particularly political before 1987, nor was he known for reckless behavior. But something about the division of Europe captured his imagination. He reportedly became obsessed with the idea that one dramatic act could change the conversation between the Soviet Union and the West. Whether this was optimism or delusion remains debated, but it pushed him to plan something that seasoned pilots would consider suicidal, a teenager's audacious plan. Rust rented a small Cessna 172 Skyhawk, one of the most common single-engine aircraft in the world. This wasn't a sophisticated machine. It had no stealth capabilities, no electronic countermeasures, and a maximum speed of around 140 miles per hour. The plane was designed for flight training and recreational flying, not penetrating militarized airspace. He planned meticulously, studying maps and flight routes for weeks. Rust told the rental company he wanted to fly around Northern Europe, filing flight plans that wouldn't raise suspicion. On May 13, 1987, he departed from Wittersee, Germany, making several stops in Scandinavia to establish a pattern of routine travel. His actual target remained hidden. Rust knew he had one advantage: the sheer absurdity of his plan. No one would expect a teenager in a tiny propeller plane to deliberately fly into Soviet territory. Air defense systems were designed to detect bombers and military aircraft, not civilian trainers flying at low altitude. He gambled that this oversight might create a narrow window of opportunity. The route he chose would take him across the Baltic Sea into Soviet airspace over Estonia and then south toward Moscow. The distance was considerable and the weather unpredictable. He packed light, carrying minimal supplies and fuel reserves. On May 28th, after finalizing his preparations in Helsinki, Rust took off and turned his aircraft eastward, breaching the Iron Curtain. What happened next exposed one of the most embarrassing security failures in Soviet military history. Rust crossed into Soviet airspace over Estonia and wasn't immediately intercepted. Soviet radar detected his aircraft multiple times, but a series of miscommunications and procedural failures prevented an effective response. At several points, Soviet air defense tracked the Cessna. Fighter jets were scrambled, but confusion about the aircraft's identity led to critical delays. Some Soviet officers assumed it was a weather reconnaissance plane or a friendly aircraft with malfunctioning transponders. The fact that Rust flew at extremely low altitude, sometimes just a few hundred feet above the ground, made continuous radar tracking difficult. Border defense protocols were strict in theory, but plagued by bureaucratic inefficiency in practice. Different military units had overlapping jurisdictions, and decisions about intercepting aircraft required approval from multiple command levels. This created a paralyzing hesitation. Officers feared making mistakes and waited for clear orders that came too late. Rust also benefited from timing. His Planetiken occurred during a period of reduced military alertness following a Border Guards Day celebration. Some reports suggest personnel were less vigilant than usual. Additionally, Soviet air defense doctrine focused on threats from NATO directions in the west, not small civilian aircraft approaching from the northwest. He flew for several hours across Soviet territory, passing over forests, towns, and military installations. At times, he descended so low that people on the ground could see the plane clearly. Some even waved, thinking it was part of some official event. The journey covered roughly 500 miles of Soviet airspace, an unthinkable penetration of what was supposed to be an impenetrable shield. Red Square Landing, May 28, 1987. As Rust approached Moscow, he faced his final challenge, finding a place to land in the heart of the city. Red Square wasn't designed as an airstrip. The cobblestones, tourists, and historical monuments made it a wildly unsuitable landing zone. But Rust circled the Kremlin and St. Basil's Cathedral, searching for any clear space. He initially attempted to land on a bridge, but found it blocked by obstacles. After another circle, he spotted a stretch of open cobblestones near the square and committed to the landing. The Cessna touched down, bounced slightly on the uneven surface, and rolled to a stop. The entire landing lasted mere seconds, but those seconds would reverberate for years. Tourists and Muscovites stood frozen in disbelief. Some thought it was a stunt or film production. Others immediately recognized the gravity of what they were witnessing. KGB agents and police rushed to the scene, surrounding the aircraft within minutes. Rust calmly opened the door, stepped out, and began signing autographs for a few brave onlookers before authorities pulled him away. The chaos that followed was immediate. Soviet officials had no protocol for this scenario. Security around the Kremlin, supposedly among the tightest in the world, had been breached by a teenager in a rented plane. Radio communications crackled with urgent messages. High-ranking officers scrambled to understand how this had happened. Within hours, the incident was being discussed at the highest levels of Soviet leadership. Immediate aftermath: arrest and interrogation. Rust was immediately taken into custody by KGB officers. He was transported to a secure facility where interrogation began almost instantly. Soviet authorities needed to determine if he was a spy, part of a larger plot, or simply what he claimed to be, an idealistic teenager with a misguided plan for peace. The interrogations were intense. KGB officers questioned him for hours about his motives, connections, and knowledge of Soviet military installations. They examined his flight logs, personal belongings, and background. Despite their skepticism, the evidence supported Rust's story. He had no intelligence training, no sophisticated equipment, and no apparent connections to Western intelligence agencies. Rust maintained his story consistently. He insisted his flight was a solo mission meant to promote dialogue between East and West. He expressed surprise at the outrage his actions had caused and seemed genuinely bewildered by the severity of the Soviet response. This naivety, whether real or performed, became a defining characteristic of his detention. Soviet authorities charged him with multiple offenses, including illegal entry into Soviet airspace, violating international flight regulations, and malicious hooliganism. The charges carried serious potential penalties. For weeks, Rust remained in Soviet custody, held in Moscow's Lefortovo prison, while officials debated how to handle the international incident his flight had created. The Soviet shockwave, a political earthquake. The embarrassment was profound and undeniable. Soviet military leadership had built an image of invincibility, particularly regarding air defense. The system that supposedly could stop NATO bombers had been breached by a 19-year-old in a plane you could rent for a few $100s. The humiliation rippled through the entire defense establishment. Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader at the time, recognized both the severity of the failure and a political opportunity. He was already pushing reforms under the banners of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. The Rust incident gave him justification to purge conservative military leaders who opposed his reforms. Defense Minister Sergei Sokolov was fired immediately. He had held the position for less than 2 years, but the failure happened on his watch, and someone had to take the fall. Marshal Alexander Koldenov, the commander of Soviet air defense forces, was also dismissed. These were not minor figures. They were high-ranking officers with decades of service and considerable political influence. The purge didn't stop there. Over the following months, hundreds of military officers were removed from their positions. Some were demoted, others forced into early retirement. The shakeup affected command structures across the Soviet military, particularly in air defense and border security divisions. Careers that had taken decades to build evaporated overnight. For Gorbachev, this was strategic. By blaming military incompetence for the incident, he weakened the conservative military establishment that opposed his reform agenda. The Rust affair became a tool to accelerate changes within Soviet power structures. The hardliners who might have resisted Gorbachev's policies found themselves on the defensive, struggling to explain how a teenager had made them look foolish. The international reaction was mixed. Western media covered the story extensively, often with barely concealed amusement. NATO officials privately questioned Soviet military capabilities. If a Cessna could reach Red Square, what did that say about Soviet ability to defend against real threats? The incident damaged Soviet prestige at a time when Gorbachev was trying to reshape the country's image abroad. The trial and punishment. Rust's trial began in September 1987, nearly 4 months after his landing. The proceedings took place in Moscow's Supreme Court, and the outcome was never in doubt. Soviet courts operated under political directives, and this case was too significant to allow for an unpredictable verdict. The charges were serious. Beyond the obvious violations of Soviet airspace and international aviation law, prosecutors emphasized the hooliganism charge, which in Soviet legal terminology meant an act that disturbed public order and showed disrespect for society. This charge carried significant prison time. Rust's defense argued that his intentions were peaceful and that he posed no threat to Soviet security. His lawyers emphasized his youth and the nonviolent nature of his actions. The argument made little impression on the court. The Soviet justice system needed to send a message. Violations of Soviet sovereignty, however unusual, would be punished severely. The verdict came swiftly. Rust was sentenced to 4 years in a labor camp for violating Soviet airspace and hooliganism. He was transferred to Lefortovo prison, where he would serve his sentence under relatively isolated conditions. The prison was known for housing political prisoners and foreigners, and Rust's treatment was closely monitored by international observers. Prison life was harsh, but not brutal. Rust was kept separate from the general prison population, both for his safety and for security reasons. He received visits from West German diplomats and family members, though these were infrequent and tightly controlled. He spent his days in a small cell with limited contact with the outside world. Release and return. Diplomatic efforts to secure Rust's release began almost immediately after his sentencing.
I hope that Gorbachev will save him from prison because it's a wrong decision.
West German government officials engaged in quiet negotiations with Soviet authorities, trying to balance the desire to bring Rust home with the need to avoid appearing to condone his actions. The geopolitical situation worked in Rust's favor. Gorbachev's reform agenda included improving relations with the West, and holding a young German pilot indefinitely served no strategic purpose. The Soviet leader needed Western cooperation and goodwill to pursue his economic and political reforms. On August 3, 1988, after serving just over a year of his sentence, Rust was released. The decision was framed as a humanitarian gesture, though political calculations clearly drove the timing. Gorbachev had recently attended several international summits and wanted to project an image of a more open, reasonable Soviet Union. Rust was flown back to West Germany, where he received a mixed reception. Some viewed him as a brave idealist who exposed Soviet weakness. Others saw him as a reckless fool whose stunt could have triggered a serious international incident. The West German government kept its official response muted, relieved to have him back, but unwilling to celebrate actions that violated international law. Life after Red Square. Rust's return to Germany didn't bring the peace he might have hoped for. He struggled to adjust to life back home, where he was simultaneously famous and infamous. Media attention was intense, with journalists constantly seeking interviews and commentary. His troubles escalated quickly. In 1989, just a year after his release, Rust was involved in a violent incident. He stabbed a female hospital colleague who had rejected his romantic advances. The attack was serious, though not life-threatening, and resulted in his conviction for attempted manslaughter. He was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. This crime shattered whatever heroic image some had attached to him. It revealed a troubled individual capable of violence, not the peaceful idealist he claimed to be during his flight to Moscow. Public opinion turned sharply against him. The narrative shifted from adventurous youth to dangerous personality. After serving his sentence, Rust largely disappeared from public life. He worked various jobs, including positions in finance and industry, but never achieved lasting stability. Interviews with him over the years revealed someone still grappling with the consequences of his actions and struggling to find purpose. In the 2000s, Rust gave occasional interviews reflecting on the flight. He expressed mixed feelings about what he'd done, acknowledging the recklessness while still maintaining that his intentions were good. He seemed genuinely surprised that his action had contributed to the military purge that followed, claiming he never intended such consequences. By the 2010s, Rust was living quietly in Germany, largely out of the public eye. He avoided media attention and declined most interview requests. Reports suggest he worked in financial consulting and lived a relatively normal, if anonymous, existence. The man who once landed in Red Square became just another middle-aged European trying to live down his youthful decisions. The legacy: how one flight changed history. The Rust incident's historical significance extends beyond the spectacle of the flight itself. It became a catalyst for changes within Soviet military and political structures at a critical moment in Cold War history. The military purge that followed weakened conservative opposition to Gorbachev's reforms. Officers who might have resisted glasnost and perestroika found themselves removed from positions of influence. This created space for Gorbachev to accelerate changes that would ultimately contribute to the Soviet Union's dissolution. The incident also damaged Soviet military prestige internationally. The image of invincibility that the Soviet armed forces had carefully cultivated was shattered. If they couldn't stop a Cessna, how effective were they, really? This perception emboldened Western policymakers and encouraged more aggressive diplomatic stances. Within the Soviet Union, the Rust affair became a symbol of systemic failure. Citizens already skeptical of government competence found confirmation in the story of a teenager flying across their country unimpeded. It fed into a growing narrative that Soviet institutions were hollow, maintained more by appearance than actual capability. Historians debate how much the flight directly contributed to the Cold War's end, but few dispute that it played a role. It exposed vulnerabilities at a moment when the Soviet system was already under strain. It provided Gorbachev with justification for reforms that accelerated the system's transformation. And it created an international spectacle that undermined Soviet authority. The story of Matthias Rust remains extraordinary because it shouldn't have been possible. Every system in place should have prevented it. Radar detection, fighter interception, air defense protocols, and simple military alertness. Yet on May 28, 1987, all those systems failed simultaneously. A teenager flew a rented plane into the heart of Moscow and landed in Red Square. The reverberations of that flight can still be felt in the history books that document the Soviet Union's final years.